In December of 1991, a woman named Sandra Carver walked to her mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in the small town of Cedar Hills, Utah. It was cold. There was snow on the ground. She was still in her coat from picking up her youngest daughter from school. She opened the mailbox, pulled out a small stack of envelopes, and began flipping through them on the walk back to the house. There was a credit card bill. It was addressed to her husband, Richard. This confused her immediately because she did not know Richard had a credit card. They had been married for 11 years. They shared a joint checking account and a savings account she helped manage. She knew their finances the way any involved spouse knows them, not obsessively, but thoroughly. And she had never seen a credit card in Richard's name. She had never seen a statement for one. She had never heard him mention one. Richard had been missing for 6 days. He had left for work on the morning of December 3rd, a Tuesday, kissed Sandra goodbye in the kitchen the way he always did, driven away in his truck, and not come home. His employer, a construction supply company in Salt Lake City where Richard had worked for 9 years, reported that he had not shown up that day. His truck was found 4 days later in the long-term parking area of Salt Lake City International Airport. His passport was missing from the fireproof box in the bedroom closet where Sandra kept the family documents. $3,000 in cash had been withdrawn from their joint account on November 29th, 4 days before he disappeared. Sandra had already spoken to police. They were treating it as a potential voluntary disappearance. She had been living for 6 days with the possibility that her husband had simply chosen to leave, that he had driven away on a Tuesday morning and not looked back. And then she opened the credit card bill. And what was listed on the charges inside that envelope, the places, the dates, the amounts, built a picture of a life that Sandra Carver had not known existed. A life her husband had been living, in parallel to the one they shared for a very long time. This is that story. Welcome back to Dark Vault. We have covered wilderness disappearances, paranormal encounters, and an unsolved death in a locked house. Tonight is different from all of them in one specific way. The story I'm about to tell you is not primarily a mystery about what happened in the darkness. It is a mystery about who someone was in the daylight, about the gap between the person you live with and the person they actually are, about what it means to discover, after years of a life built together, that one of the architects of that life was building something else on the side. I find this category of story harder than the others. Harder because it does not have a monster. It has a person who made choices and kept secrets and left behind a wife and 2 children and a community that thought it knew him. And when I tell you what Sandra found on that credit card bill and what the subsequent investigation revealed over the years that followed, I want you to hold on to the fact that every name in this story belongs to a real human being. The Carvers were real. Their children are real adults now, and Sandra Carver, who is in her late 60s, has spoken about this case publicly in the years since and given permission for the story to be told. This is me doing my best to tell it the way it deserves to be told. Richard Allen Carver was born in 1954 in Provo, Utah, the oldest of 4 children. He grew up in a religious household. The family was devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and by all accounts of people who knew him growing up, he was a model of the community's values. Hardworking, quiet, responsible. He served a 2-year mission in Brazil in his early 20s, came home, enrolled in a vocational program, and began building a career in construction and construction supply. He met Sandra in 1979 at a church social event. She was 22. He was 25. They dated for 14 months and married in the Salt Lake Temple in June of 1980. Sandra has described their early marriage as genuinely happy. Not perfect, no marriage is perfect, but solid, warm, built on shared values and mutual affection. Richard was not demonstrative in the way some men are. He was not given to grand romantic gestures, but he was present. He came home for dinner. He coached their daughter's soccer team. He attended school events. He was the kind of husband and father that people in their community pointed to as an example of how it was supposed to look. Over the course of their marriage, Sandra noticed occasional periods of what she describes as distance, times when Richard seemed preoccupied in a way she could not access. Not angry, not cold exactly, but somewhere else in his mind. She attributed it to work stress. Construction supply was a cyclical business, and Richard carried the weight of his professional responsibilities seriously. She did not probe. She trusted him the way you trust a person you have been married to for over a decade. In retrospect, Sandra has said that the distance became more pronounced in the years before he disappeared. But she could not, in the moment, point to anything concrete. He was still coming home. He was still present at family events. He was still, to the observable eye, the same Richard he had always been, just sometimes further away. The last week of Richard's life at home was ordinary. Sandra has gone over it many times, in conversations with investigators and in her own private accounting of what she missed. He was quieter than usual, maybe. He declined to watch a movie with her on Sunday night, saying he was tired. On Monday, he had a phone call in the study that he took with the door closed, which was unusual enough that she noticed it, but not unusual enough that she asked about it. On Tuesday morning, he made breakfast, helped get their younger daughter ready for school, kissed Sandra at the door, and drove away. His employer called at 3 in the afternoon to ask if Richard was ill, because he had not come in and had not called. Sandra told them she would have him call when he got home. By 5 o'clock, she was starting to worry. By 7, she had called his brother. By 9, she had called the police. The officer who came to the house that night told her that adults were permitted to leave voluntarily and that there was nothing immediately actionable. He took a report. He was kind. He was not alarmed. Neither, entirely, was Sandra. Not yet. It took another 2 days for the full shape of what had happened to become clear. The withdrawal of $3,000 from their joint account on November 29th, which Sandra had not noticed at the time because it was Richard who typically balanced the statements. The passport missing from the fireproof box. The truck in the airport parking lot, discovered on the 4th day of the search by an officer who had flagged it for a parking violation. These details, assembled together, told a story. The story was that Richard Carver had planned to leave, that he had prepared, that he had taken money, taken his passport, and driven to an airport and gone somewhere. It did not tell Sandra where. It did not tell her why. And it did not tell her who he was going to. The credit card bill arrived 6 days after he disappeared. Sandra has described opening it on the front walk in the cold as one of the most surreal moments of her life. The card had been opened in Richard's name alone, at an address she did not recognize, apparently 18 months earlier. The credit limit was $4,000. The statement showed charges from the previous 2 months, restaurant charges in Salt Lake City on evenings when Richard had told Sandra he was working late, hotel charges, a florist, a jeweler, $240 at a jeweler in downtown Salt Lake City for something Sandra had never received and never seen, and a name, not Richard's name, a second name on the account. An authorized user, a woman named Patricia Holt. Sandra turned the credit card bill over to the police that same evening. What followed was an investigation that would last, in various forms, for years. I want to walk you through what investigators found, and I want to do it in the order they found it, because the way this story reveals itself matters as much as the revelations themselves. Patricia Holt was 31 years old in December 1991. She lived in an apartment in the Sugar House neighborhood of Salt Lake City. She worked as a dental hygienist at a practice near downtown. She had been in Salt Lake City for 3 years, having relocated from Denver. She had no criminal record. She was not, by any immediate external measure, a person who seemed connected to the disappearance of a married man in Cedar Hills. But her name was on the credit card. And when investigators knocked on her door 3 days after Sandra handed them the bill, what Patricia told them changed the shape of the investigation entirely. Patricia Holt had been in a relationship with Richard Carver for 14 months. She had met him at a professional conference in Salt Lake City in October of 1990. She had known he was married. He had told her from early in the relationship that his marriage was effectively over, that he and Sandra lived as roommates, that they had not been genuinely together for years, that he was planning to leave. He had told Patricia he loved her. He had told her they would be together when the time was right. He had spent, by Patricia's account, at least 1 or 2 nights a week at her apartment over the course of their relationship. He had taken her to dinner. He had bought her a necklace, $240 from the jeweler on the statement. He had told her, in the weeks before he disappeared, that the time was finally right, that he was leaving, that they would go somewhere and start over. Patricia Holt had not heard from Richard since December 2nd, the day before he disappeared from Sandra's perspective. She had been expecting him. He had told her to be ready to go on a moment's notice. She had been sitting in her apartment with a packed bag, waiting for a call that had not come. She had, by her own account, been growing increasingly frightened as the days passed. When investigators knocked on her door, she thought, for a moment, that it was Richard. The expression on her face when she opened the door and found 2 plainclothes officers is something the lead investigator on the case, a detective named Frank Oliphant, has described in the one long interview he gave about the case. He said she looked like someone who had just understood that something was very wrong. Patricia Holt was not a suspect. She was a witness, and she told investigators everything she knew, which was, in many ways, as incomplete a picture as Sandra had. Neither woman had known who Richard actually was. Sandra had known the version of Richard who came home for dinner and coached soccer and attended church. Patricia had known the version who came to her apartment on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and talked about leaving and starting over. And somewhere between those 2 versions was the actual man, who had withdrawn $3,000 and taken his passport and driven to an airport and vanished. Here is where the investigation found something that neither Sandra nor Patricia had anticipated. Something that made the story of Richard Carver considerably more complicated than a man who ran away from his marriage. Detective Oliphant, in the process of building a financial picture of Richard's life, subpoenaed records beyond the joint account and the credit card. He went looking for the full financial history, and what he found was a third account. Not a joint account, not the credit card. A separate savings account in Richard's name alone, at a bank in Murray, Utah, that neither Sandra nor Patricia knew existed. The account had been opened in 1987, 4 years before Richard disappeared. Over those 4 years, small amounts had been regularly deposited. Never enough to be alarming. Never enough to create a noticeable gap in the household finances. But consistently, methodically, over 48 months, Richard Carver had been moving money into an account that no one in his life knew about. The balance at the time of his disappearance was $31,000. Combined with the $3,000 withdrawn from the joint account, Richard Carver had left with at least $34,000 in cash and liquid assets. In 1991 dollars. That is not the financial picture of a man who made an impulsive decision to run. That is the financial picture of a man who had been planning his disappearance for at least 4 years. The passport, when investigators traced its issuance, had been renewed in 1989, 2 years before the disappearance. The renewal had been processed through a P.O. box in Salt Lake City that Richard had opened in 1988, a P.O. box that Sandra did not know about. A P.O. box through which investigators discovered Richard had been receiving mail for 3 years. They were never able to obtain the contents of that mail. The P.O. box had been closed by Richard in person on November 28th, 4 days before he disappeared, the day before he withdrew the $3,000. The picture that assembled from these details was of a man who had been building an exit for years, who had maintained parallel financial infrastructure, parallel identity logistics alongside his ordinary life in Cedar Hills, who had, in some sense, been living in anticipation of departure for nearly as long as Sandra could identify the periods of distance she had attributed to work stress. The question that investigators could not answer, and still cannot answer, is where he went. The airport surveillance footage from December 3, 1991 was reviewed. Richard Carver's face did not appear in any footage that could be identified with confidence. This was not unusual for the era. Airport surveillance in 1991 was considerably less comprehensive than it is today. No passenger manifest showed his name on any flight departing Salt Lake City that day, which either means he used a different name or he did not fly from Salt Lake City, or both. Sandra Carver spent the years immediately following Richard's disappearance in what she has described as a prolonged state of disorientation. Not grief, exactly, because grief requires knowing what you have lost. What Sandra experienced was the dismantling of her understanding of 11 years. Every memory she revisited had to be re-examined for what it might have meant in light of what she now knew. Every evening, Richard had said he was working late. Every closed door, every unexplained quietness. The distance she had attributed to stress. All of it had to be held up against the new information and reassessed. She had 2 daughters to raise. The older one was 9 when Richard left. The younger was 6. Sandra has spoken about the specific challenge of explaining to a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old that their father had gone away and that she did not know where or why. That the honest answer to the question children always ask, "Is he coming back?" was that she did not know. That she could not promise either way. She divorced Richard in absentia in 1994 after the legal waiting period for missing persons in Utah had elapsed. She remained in Cedar Hills. She went back to work. She had a background in bookkeeping and found a position with a local business. She raised her daughters. She built, with remarkable determination and in the face of something that would have broken many people entirely, a life that functioned and even, eventually, contained real happiness. Patricia Holt moved away from Salt Lake City in 1993. She has not spoken publicly about the case. Her cooperation with the investigation was complete and voluntary. She was, in every meaningful sense, another person that Richard left behind. The investigative file notes that Patricia was initially cooperative, and then, as the investigation progressed and the picture of Richard's long-term planning became clearer, became noticeably quieter. Detective Oliphant has speculated that the revelation of the secret savings account and the 4-year planning timeline was difficult for Patricia in a specific way, because it suggested that Richard's promises to her were also part of a performance, that the man who had told her he loved her and that they would start over was the same man who had been systematically planning his own disappearance in ways that did not include her. No confirmed sighting of Richard Carver was ever verified after December 3, 1991. There were reported sightings, a handful of them over the years passed to investigators through tip lines. A man resembling his description seen in Phoenix in 1993. A report from a former colleague who believed he spotted someone matching Richard at a hotel in Cancun in 1996. None of these was ever confirmed. None produced evidence sufficient to establish his location. Richard Allen Carver would be 70 years old today. He may be alive. He may have been living somewhere for 33 years under a name no one who knew him would recognize. He may be dead, an unknown man in an unknown place, his connection to the life he left behind severed so completely that no one who mourns him knows to. He may have built a third life somewhere, the way he built a second one alongside Sandra's, with the same methodical patience and the same practiced ability to be present enough to be believed. I think about what it requires of a person to do what Richard did, not the logistics. Those are comprehensible, even if they are extraordinary in their patience and their detail. I think about what it requires emotionally. To sit across from someone at dinner every night, to kiss them goodbye in the morning, to coach their daughter's soccer team and attend school events, and maintain every outward form of a life you have already decided to leave. To sustain that performance for years. To feel, presumably, whatever it is a person feels while doing that, and to continue anyway. I am not able to find the charitable version of it. I have tried because I think it is important to try. Some people who write about cases like this suggest that Richard must have been suffering, that the parallel life, the secret planning, the inability to simply leave directly must point to some profound internal conflict that made a clean departure impossible. Maybe. I do not know what was inside Richard Carver. Nobody does. What I know is what he left behind. A wife who had to reassemble her understanding of 11 years. 2 daughters who grew up without a father and without an explanation. And a woman in an apartment in Sugar House who had packed a bag and was waiting for a call that never came. Sandra Carver gave an interview to a Utah newspaper in 2018 on what would have been her and Richard's 38th wedding anniversary. She was asked if she still thought about him. She said yes, but differently than she used to. She said that for years she thought about him with anger, then with confusion, then with something she could only describe as a kind of exhausted curiosity. She said she had stopped needing to understand why a long time ago. What she occasionally still wanted, she said, was simply to know what happened. Not for herself, she was clear about that. She was, by 2018, genuinely fine. But for her daughters, who were adults with their own families, and who deserved to have a complete answer to the question of where their father went. As of this recording, that question remains open. Richard Carver is listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. His case is technically active. If he is alive, he is a 70-year-old man who has spent 33 years not being Richard Carver. If he is dead, he is an unidentified man somewhere, whose connection to a family in Cedar Hills, Utah has never been established. The credit card bill that Sandra found in the mailbox in December of 1991 is still in an evidence box in the Kern County investigative file. That single piece of mail, addressed to a man Sandra did not know had a credit card, bearing a name Sandra did not recognize, carrying charges for dinners and hotels and a necklace, was the first crack in the surface of a life that had been for years presenting as solid. Everything that came after it, the savings account, the P.O. box, the renewed passport, the 4 years of quiet preparation, was already there beneath that surface, waiting. The way things that are hidden always wait. Patiently, and for as long as it takes, for someone to open the right envelope on the right Tuesday afternoon. That is the story of Sandra Carver, Richard Carver, and the credit card bill that arrived 6 days after he disappeared. If this story affected you, and I think it might, for reasons that are different from the previous 3, drop a comment below. I find that the stories that unsettle people the most are not always the ones with monsters. Sometimes they are the ones about the ordinary Tuesday morning and the kiss goodbye and the man who drove away. If you have information about the whereabouts of Richard Allen Carver, born 1954 in Provo, Utah, his case remains listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. His family is still asking. New video every week on Dark Vault. Next week, we are going somewhere we have not been yet, a story that has been sitting in my research folder for months and that I have found genuinely difficult to finish writing, which, in my experience, means it is exactly the kind of story this channel was built for. Subscribe if you have not. Thank you for being here, and remember, the most disturbing secrets are not always the ones that announce themselves in the dark. Sometimes they arrive on a Tuesday afternoon in the mailbox, addressed to someone you thought you knew. Stay strange, stay careful.